first became aware of Rabbi Wieder, I think it was an impromptu speech. Nobody was getting up, and it was at Beth Abraham. This is many, many years ago. He got up there. He was eloquent. He was very insightful, and he was a pleasure to listen to. But it wasn't until many years later, a friend forwarded me his Rabbi Wider's speech that was posted on YU Torah about fiscal burdens, financial responsibilities, and community responsibilities. That when I listened to it, I really became hooked on his message and his principles and a lot of what he stands for. And when Kosher Money, which I'm affiliated, I'm a sponsor, I've been a long-lasting commentator over there, they mentioned that Rabbi Wieder is going to be speaking on one of their episodes. I said, he's phenomenal, people are going to love it. And clearly, with 30,000 views in a little bit more than a month, the message is really resonating with people. We thought that it would be a great opportunity to bring Rabbi Wieder to the community. As I was speaking to many of you, we weren't sure what the age demographic would be bringing in Rabbi Wieder, and I'm happy that we got a very mixed crowd over here. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, "Aseh lecha rav v'koneh lecha chaver v'avei dana es kol ha'adam lekavzchos." Make for yourself a rav, acquire a friend, and judge everybody favorably. Many commentators comment on the word make for yourself a rav and acquire for your friend. For me, I think this is the perfect venue for combining all of these, where you have a rav who's going to be talking about acquiring things, material acquisitions, and communal responsibilities. And with that, I turn it over to Rabbi Wieder. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. There are two topics that I wanted to address in my brief remarks tonight, and for those of you who listen to the podcast, it's probably not so much new. But two of them that I think are the primary economic challenges in our community. There's a third, but which I don't want to talk about because it's not really our community per se. The first two are what I would call the Hanukkah problem and the Purim problem. The first one is materialism, which I would describe as a Hanukkah problem. I don't know that materialism itself is an existential threat to the community's continuing existence, but it's certainly a threat to its spiritual existence. There are many people who live materialistic lifestyles who can afford it. That doesn't make it appropriate. Obviously, there are people who can't and feel the need to keep up with the Joneses, which is more of a problem, but it's fundamentally a Hanukkah problem. You can make the choices for yourself and you can survive, but spiritually, it's a tremendous challenge of what the whole purpose of being a frum Jew should be. The second one, which is I think I'll call the Purim problem, which is really an actual threat to the physical existence of the community, is the yeshiva tuition issue. The third one, which I don't want to talk about because it's not really specific to our community, but it's a broader American society issue which affects us in particular, is the cost of living question, particularly housing is the most extreme. That's not a problem that our community has created. It's a societal problem. It's particularly acute for the modern Orthodox community in general because we tend to be concentrated in high cost of living areas, but that's not a conscious choice in many ways on our part. But I really want to talk about the first two. Now, the first two issues they're very separate in one way, but they have common roots. And I would say that there are sort of three questions, which I'm not going to address at great length, but I want to just touch upon quickly. Number one, what is the purpose of money from a Torah perspective? What are we supposed to do with our money? The second question, which goes along with that, is to whom does our money actually belong? And the third, which is more tangential, but I think it's a broader societal issue and it's an internal issue, is what is our vision of an economically just society? Many people have said that the modern Orthodox community is a very wealthy community, which in the aggregate is true. But as one of my close friends likes to point out, even the modern Orthodox community has a very broad spread. Probably most people, even those struggling in the modern Orthodox community, are probably, for the most part, wealthier than most Americans, or a large number of Americans. But the bottom line is that in many situations, poverty is relative, and it's a real struggle if you want to live in this community. So even though we are a very wealthy community, much like broader American society, it is not equally distributed wealth. Now, the response to these three questions, the purpose of money from a Torah perspective, a person who has money, is the very simple one, which is the purpose of everything that a person has, which is called Pa'al Hashem Lamanehu. Everything we have is supposed to be used in the service of God. And even when something is not technically required or something is not technically prohibited, that doesn't mean that we're not obligated to serve God. The second, which I think really is maybe the heart of the problem, and our attitudes are, on the one hand, reflective of norms throughout human history and Jewish history. On the other hand, are particularly reflective of American culture, is how do we look at the ownership? To whom does our money belong? And undoubtedly, from a legal and halachic perspective, a person's money belongs to a person who has earned that money legitimately. It belongs to them. But from a hashkafic, a philosophical perspective, this is not the way a Torah Jew looks at it. In Parshas Bahar, we read about the prohibition of selling land permanently, and the Torah says, Ki li haaretz. The land doesn't really belong to you; it belongs to the Ribbono Shel Olam. When David HaMelech speaks about the overwhelming donations to the Beis Hamikdash, and he was floored by how much money was given. So he says to God, Ki mimcha kol miyadcha nasanu lach. Everything comes from you, and when we give you something, it's the way I describe it, it's taking from God's right pocket and putting it into his left pocket. And the Torah, in his introduction to Hilchos Tzedakah, when he talks about attitudes towards tzedakah, he says that a person shouldn't be uncomfortable or shouldn't feel unhappy about giving away the appropriate amount of tzedakah, which I'll add in here when one can afford as a chomesh, not meiser, because the Torah describes the situation as follows. If you have money, you should understand that you're really a trustee and God is the grantor. And if you were actually a trustee in somebody's estate and the person said, give 20% to tzedakah, it probably wouldn't bother you. It's not your money, so it doesn't trouble you. So the Torah says you're supposed to look at your money that way. So undoubtedly, from a judicial perspective, a person's money, we do believe in private property, but from a philosophical perspective, one is supposed to look at one's property as coming from God and basically being a trust. And speaking of that question of inequality in our community, or what I would call an economically just society, the Torah, I think, sends a very clear message in the laws of Yovel, which are basically in an agricultural society, prevent great concentrations of wealth and great concentrations of poverty. The laws of Shmitas Ksafim, but dissolving loans, and the prohibition on taking interest, all outline a particular vision for society and a community. I don't know how to translate that from an agricultural society into a capital-based society, but it would be deeply religiously disturbing to not recognize what the Torah's message is. In this particular context, part of the problem is that we are ensconced in a broader Western liberal culture, particularly our community, even with the unevenness in the distribution of wealth, is in the upper middle class for the most part, or upper class of this country, and we absorb the attitudes and values from that particular group of society, and that part of society is very happy with the current economic distribution. But one should not confuse the Torah's view on economics and money with that of contemporary society of any political stripe. Certainly there's a very strong strain in American thought, conservative financial thought, which might be described as kochi v'yotzem yadi asali es hachayil hazeh, and I'm not going to talk about that anymore tonight, but suffice it to say Moshe Rabbeinu spent a lot of time in his farewell speech trying to disabuse us of that notion. Now, I want to talk first about the challenge of materialism, and I think that there are two major qualities that are a challenge in our community, and again, I don't think it's unique to our community. It's not just the modern Orthodox community. It's true, I think, across most of the Orthodox community, and it's certainly true in broader society. Number one is the concept of Kedusha. Kedusha, to use Jonathan Haidt's type in the righteous mind, so we are part of what's called the weird demographic, Western, educated, intellectual, rich, and democratic. And in this slice of American society, there is no concept of Kedusha. In this particular worldview, if you're not hurting anybody else, all is okay. We can dispute what is hurting somebody else, but bottom line, there's no notion of restraining oneself from enjoying any of the pleasures of any variety in the world if you're not hurting anybody else. That is the antithesis of the Torah's philosophy. Kedusha is one of the central values. We don't talk about it very much in our community except for in very limited contexts, but it's something that's supposed to govern everything that we do. The Ramban, there's a very famous Ramban that I'm sure many of you know at the beginning of Parshas Kedoshim, where the Ramban describes Kedusha, or Kedoshim tiyu es kadesh atzmacha b'mutolach. That the Torah, once you keep the laws of kashrus, and once you observe the laws of taras hamishpacha, and once you observe the laws of lashon hara, halavai, and other prohibited speech, you could basically do anything else that you want. You could be shatuf bezima, you could be stuffing yourself to the gills however you like, eating gluttonously, and you don't technically violate any prohibition. But what Kedusha means is that even though there are things that are permitted, we strive to create a different kind of spiritual personality, and we exercise restraint, not necessarily asceticism, in every single area of our life. The Ramban has these triplet concepts, all of which are challenging for our community, along with Kedoshim Tiyu V'Zvasisa Hayashar V'Atov, which is Lifnim Mishuras Adin, and the concept of Shabboson, which means that even though you keep the 39 malachos on Shabbos, there's something called Shabbosdik as well. What these all have in common is that these are not specific laws, but they are sort of a broader spiritual ethos that the Torah is trying to create that we are supposed to live by. I put it in another context. A lot of people are very good in our community at seeing the trees, but they're not so good at seeing the forest. And Kedusha, as such a central value, can only be achieved when a person engages in restraint. I can have all the money in the world, but that doesn't mean it's appropriate for me to live in a certain kind of house, drive a certain kind of car, take a certain kind of vacation, etc. It doesn't matter that I can afford it. It doesn't even matter if I'm not raising the bar for anybody else because I'm so wealthy, nobody looks at me as a model. It's a violation of Kedusha, even if it's not technically prohibited. There's a lot to say about that, but I would just issue two sentences that I think is, perhaps I shouldn't tonight just because there's not enough time to elaborate. But I think that a spiritual human being's existence, the way the Gemara describes it, is a struggle between our animal side and our angelic side. And what Kedusha is about is de-emphasizing our side that is like the animals and emphasizing the side which is like the angels. The second quality which plays into this, but this is not about consumption and materialism, but about conspicuous consumption, is the value of tznius. For the most part, in our educational settings, when tznius is spoken about, it's generally a cudgel wielded against women to dress in a particular way. That has only a little bit to do with tznius. It does, but it's the tiniest part of tznius. Tznius applies to men and women equally, in dress, in comportment, in how one spends their money and one spends the time that they use and what they show to other people. The best definition of tznius, is a very good friend of mine who's a long-time mechaneches likes to say, is keeping what's private private. And we don't talk about tznius. I think our schools avoid it precisely because of the way it's been used. But it is such a central value. I think I said I don't know that I said this in the Kosher Money podcast, but it was in a previous presentation where I observed that, you know what, if you want to go to the fanciest ski resort in, I don't know, Colorado, Utah, wherever it is now, go, but do me one favor. Don't let anybody else who's not with you see any pictures or know that you went. And I suspect that for some people, that would be fine. But for some people, there's a large part of the thrill is that I can show everybody what I did. And so I'm not saying that I think it's a great idea to go to the fanciest ski resort, but at the very least, you don't have to show it off for other people. When we should really think about the question, when we buy things, or when we make a simcha or any other kinds of spending, A, whether we really need it, and B, how much is it because we really want that, and how much it is signaling to other people what we have and what our status is. And this particular issue, the tznius issue, is really, really damaging to the community. It's damaging to us as individuals, spiritually. It's terrible for families who struggle, who can't keep up with the Joneses, but somehow either try to or just can't and don't even bother. And it's really terrible for children. It's really terrible for children. One of the big struggles of Kedusha, Ashkenazim at least, the Nusach Sfarad doesn't say this, but in Nusach Ashkenaz, so year-round, we say in Shochenad, we say, B'kerev Kedoshim Tiskadash. We sacrifice the acrostic of Rivka in the process because we only have Yitzchak, we don't have Rivka. On Yom Noraim, we B'nai Ashkenaz do like Nusach Sfard, and we arrange the stanzas so that we have both Rivka and Yitzchak, but instead we lose Uvekerev Kedoshim Tiskadash. I think it's Uvekerev Kedoshim Tisalo. Why the difference? Nusach Sfard is consistent. Why the difference in Nusach Ashkenaz? So I think that the answer is that the way we view Kedusha, a certain kind of restraint, is that it has to be as part of a community. We don't believe in going off being monks in a desert monastery, being ascetics there. Kedusha has to be achieved within the context of a Kehila Kedosha. On Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, when we are all striving for Kedusha generally, so you don't need to remind people of the Kerev Kedusha and Tiskadash. You can preserve the acrostic of Rivka. But the rest of the year when we're striving for Kedusha, when not everybody is focused on it, you have to be reminded of the Kerev Kedusha and Tiskadash, that Kedusha may mean precious from things. It doesn't mean precious from the community. There's a flip side to this. In order for individuals to achieve Kedusha, the community has to be striving for Kedusha as well. And to achieve a certain kind of restraint within a community is really hard when everybody else around you is indulging in a certain type of lifestyle. So even if a person can afford it, when anybody can see you, which is most of our consumption, there is consumption that maybe can't be seen, but so much of the consumption, the homes and the cars for sure, the vacations, depending on whether you choose to share it, etc. When you make a choice, when any one of us makes a choice to spend in a certain way, it does a lot of damage to individuals, to families, to children, and to the fabric of the community. And this is so much of this stuff that we just simply don't need. There's a story that my wife likes to remind me of about a Hasidic Rebbe. And his Gevir comes to him and tells the Rebbe, Rebbe, when I eat my meals, I eat just bread and water, This is really a wonderful thing. And the Rebbe says to him, no. You shouldn't eat bread and water. You should eat really good foods. So okay, so he leaves. The Hasidim want to know why. So he said, you have to understand, if he's feeding himself bread and water, what do you think he's going to be giving to the poor people? Now, the Hasidic Rebbe might have been a wise person, and as a pragmatic issue, that might be true, and nor am I suggesting that we need to be eating only bread and water, but I think that as a matter of a spiritual being, I don't think the Hasidic Rebbe would have said that the ideal striving would be to have a fancy lifestyle. And that, at least, is inconspicuous consumption, for the most part, what you eat. The Hasidic Rebbe wasn't talking about everything else that everybody can see. So that's the topic of what I call Kedusha. And I think as I said, it's a real challenge for our community. The celebrations, I was noting recently, I think that the way bar mitzvahs are made now, the way weddings were probably 50 years ago. There is simply no reason for so many of these smachos to be done on the scale that they're being done. It's kind of mind-boggling. It's not necessary. And it's not just the people who can't afford it. The people who can afford it should really think about what you're doing to the people who can't. There's another issue, though. I want to go to the second issue. To me, in some ways, this is the more important issue, and I'll say maybe the more controversial issue. It's an idea that I broached in the Kosher Money podcast, and I know there are people who will be supportive initially. There are people who will be resistant, but I think it's really, really important. As I said before, the issue of materialism is the choice of individuals to some extent, and the onus to solve that problem rests upon the individual. Once upon a time, there were things called sumptuary laws where people were not allowed to spend more on a simcha than a certain amount of money. Those don't work too well, although they could be tried. But fundamentally, individuals do have choices. It can be hard, but you have a choice to live in a smaller house, a choice to drive a used car, a choice not to go on vacations. Those are choices an individual can make. But the issue of tuition and how we fund our schools is both, I think, an existential issue for the community, and fundamentally it's a communal responsibility and really can only be dealt with by the community. Now, I know that there are a lot of practical questions, but I'm really more interested in the theory here, both on a hashkafic Torah level and on a pragmatic level. Chinuch, as formulated by the Torah, and as the Gemara in Baba Basra describes, was originally the obligation of a parent, specifically the obligation of a father. Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla, who was praised by the Gemara, understood that wasn't working. Someone who didn't have a father, someone who had a father who couldn't teach the child, it wasn't working. Ultimately, Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla instituted something that led to a situation where educating children is the community's responsibility. If the community doesn't do it, a parent has to do the best that they can. But fundamentally speaking, it is a communal responsibility. It's a communal responsibility to pay for it. Obviously, the communities once upon a time, until the Enlightenment, had the powers of internal powers of taxation. But we should not forget that supporting our yeshivas, educating our children, is fundamentally now a communal responsibility. And our community is failing at this. Essentially a complete failure, certainly in the model. The model that we've adopted is the model of American private school. If you are not an Orthodox Jew or a religious individual of any stripe committed to sending your child to a school where the values of the school are in tune with your own religious values, you send your child to the public schools. How do public schools paid for? They're paid for through your taxes. You pay your taxes if you live in Teaneck. If you pay X dollars for your real estate taxes, 3/4 of that or so, something like that, 70% goes to the public schools of Teaneck, or if you're in Bergenfield, the same thing. And you pay that over a lifetime. You pay that before you have children in the schools, when you have children in the schools, when you're finished with the schools. You pay that throughout a lifetime until you retire and move away. That is the way we pay for schools in this country, and I think the fundamentally correct way. And ironically, it's not the reason why I do it. That's the Torah way of doing things. We've adopted the model of user pay-as-you-go, which is a wonderful model for fancy private schools in America, because generally speaking, people who send to private schools in America tend to be fairly wealthy people. The one exception that I can think of that on a broad scale are the Catholic schools. The Catholic schools, however, have a model that's closer to the public school model, which is Catholics who tithe to the church. There is a small tuition, relatively speaking, and that's how their schools are funded. And that is the way Torah community funds its schools. There are two ways in theory to do that. The one which I'm not in favor of is having a smaller number of individuals who are very wealthy fund the schools. There are many reasons I think that's not ideal. But the proper way of doing it is having a broad-based funding model from the community where people understand that when you move into a community, you pay a certain amount of money to the schools every year that you live in the community, until the point if you're retired and you can't. Again, there are a lot of details to work out, but that is fundamentally the model. Someone who listened to the Kosher Money podcast said to me, I was, I guess, flattered by this. He said something I said he just couldn't get out of his mind for weeks, which was this idea that if everybody in the community paid, I probably suggest a number, $15,000, $20,000 in a year, that would fund the entire yeshiva system. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but it's probably something in that neighborhood. He worked it out in his community, which was a big out-of-town community. I think he said if everybody gave, it would be $10,000 a family. Advice to him was given, and I think this is good advice, that there should be a small tuition. In his case, it was something like, I don't know, $2,500 that you pay for both for legal reasons and for other reasons, but the bulk of the funding would come from community money that's given. There's an obvious financial advantage in that, which is that it's tax deductible because it is actually a charitable contribution because nobody can mandate it. When you just think about what such a system would do for the community, if I told you that in order to be a modern Orthodox Jew, you had to earn $20,000 more, okay, of tax deductibility, or let's add in 4 children, another $10,000, which is taxable. If I told you that all you needed to earn more than your neighbor was $35,000 a year, that would be huge. That would be absolutely huge. If you do the mathematics now, the amount that you need to send 4 kids to yeshiva in Bergen County pre-tax is probably something like $130,000, $140,000 for most families, for virtually all the schools. And even if one were to take the cheapest school here, it would still work out to be a number like $70,000, $75,000. That's a huge amount of money to have to earn. More on top of paying all your other expenses on an annual basis. And the impact, and I think I spoke about this in the podcast, if you just look at what our kids are being forced to do, the pressure that's on them, the limited number of careers that they can choose, the stresses are absolutely enormous. And it also leads to a community, very, very narrow community. In my parents' generation, this isn't so common anymore. There were lots of people who were professors, and you could live in the community that way. You go to the next generation, and there was lots of doctors, earning a living that way. You probably could still earn a living as a doctor. But now, if you were to go to YU, and it would seem that the only way you could earn a living is you go work on Wall Street. And without even talking about the kinds of things that are done, and their social utility, it's an option that not everybody can do, and it creates a community that I don't know that so many of us would want to live in when we reach that particular point. But it's horrible for our children. For some of you, it's you're in this boat. For some of you, it's our children. It's the next generation who are going to have to deal with this. And so I think that the only way our community is really going to survive in a meaningful way is to do the right thing, which is to adopt the Torah model. It means some type of a communal assessment. There has to be some degree of flexibility in terms of not everybody. There will be some people who can't afford it. One particular suggestion that I like very much that has been suggested by a couple of friends is that your assessment that you give should be tied to your real estate taxes. Meaning if you're choosing to live in a certain kind of house, that means you are making a certain choice in life. You can probably afford to give that in tzedakah as well. But I think that is the only long-term feasible way to go. Now, I know that there are two sets of problems or challenges with this. The one that I don't want to talk about tonight is as soon as we've persuaded everybody that this is the way to go and people are going to give them, enough people are going to give the money, how do you work out all the details? There are 100 details, 100 questions. When I have this dream that all of a sudden I persuaded everybody and enough people to go this way, okay, now I see the 100 questions coming at me. There are a lot of smart people in this community who can figure out an honest, transparent way. Well, now that we have this money that's coming in, how do we distribute it to the yeshivas? What's the rule? There are a lot of questions that come up. But if you can solve the first problem, we'll be able to solve those problems. If people understand their obligation, their Torah obligation, their halachic responsibility, their hashkafic responsibility to give in a certain way, and again, we're not talking about huge sums of money. We're not asking somebody to give $100,000 a year. We're talking $15,000 to $20,000 a year, which if you were living in this community, in the overwhelming majority of cases, that wouldn't be, that might be your tzedakah budget or something in that range. It's really not a huge amount, but everybody or almost everybody has to do it. I had a meeting recently I was asked by a rabbi in the community if I would meet with him and one gevir in his shul, who I happen to know. And I think that the rabbi thought that I was going to sit down with the gevir and I was going to explain to the gevir how we're supposed to do this, and the gevir was going to make sure it got carried out. What the rabbi didn't realize is that he was going to walk out, and the gevir who's gives tremendous amount of money in the community, and I don't think that he's not willing to give money, but he basically said to the rabbi, who was his rabbi, he said, it's very nice, I'm happy to give money, but the person in shul sitting next to me said, well, why should I give? Why should I give? And what he said to the rabbi, and I believe he's correct, is that fundamentally speaking, what has to happen first is the community has to be educated. I'm pretty sure, I know that that I was talking with Doug about this before, we have, as far as I know, in yeshivas, no financial literacy education. That's true from a pragmatic perspective. We also have no Torah education about a philosophy of money. We don't teach Hilchos Tzedakah. We don't teach anything that I know of. In the realm of Choshen Mishpat, I don't mean being ethical and honest, but that's true as well. We don't talk about these issues, right? It's nice that they may bring a pushka around, and it's good for children to be habituated, but we don't talk about what is the Torah's, philosophy. I imagine talking about the obligation, the way the Shulchan Aruch, the way the Gemara describes funding yeshivas, I imagine that would be news to many people, maybe in this room and many people in this community. So if the educators and the Rabbanim are not talking about this issue, and I don't know that there's anybody in the room who, other than myself here, but maybe I apologize if I'm missing anybody, maybe there's somebody here, the Rabbanim have to start talking about this issue. There's no question about it. And we have to be receptive to it, right? It's not, they have to be talking about it regularly, and we have to be receptive to this idea. And because I honestly believe that if we don't change this model, as a community, we're not going to survive. I think that the pieces are starting to unravel, and the community that will be left will not be a community that I think many of us, I'll speak for myself, would want to live in and would want to be a part of. Let's put it this way: there was he's not from, and I would say probably embittered, but a Muslim of YU who has written very harshly about the modern Orthodox community. I think I quoted it in the podcast. which he basically described modern Orthodoxy as a country club establishment. And from a realistic perspective on the ground, he's not wrong. It pains me to admit that he's right, but basically, if you're not of a certain degree of wealth, it's almost impossible to live in this community, certainly to move into it now. I have always believed, I might be one of the few people, I really believe in a philosophy that's almost dead called Torah Mada, and I believe that is the lechatchila shebelechatchilas of hashkafos. I'm not minimizing anybody else's approach. But it pains me deeply to think that someone who wants to live in a community where at least lip service is still being paid to that philosophy, I'd like to think that people in the right-wing Orthodox world, if all of a sudden they see the light, they want to join us, and I'd have to tell them, sorry, I know you'd like to join us, and there are people who like the community, want to join, and basically they can't because they can't afford to do so. And that is a travesty of epic proportions, that we've created a community, intentionally or not, where basically people who want to join because they see this as God's ideal vision for the world cannot join because basically they don't make enough money to do so. That's just, it's mind-boggling. I know that this particular model is going to take time to sell. I know it's particularly hard for people, and there are many people in this room, I would put myself included, who finished paying yeshiva tuition. And will say, well, look, I struggled to pay yeshiva tuition, or didn't. I paid my share, and why should I let them pay for it? And especially to people, some people who've struggled to do so and who've sacrificed to do so, I hear that, but I just asked a very simple question. Number one, the fact that the community did things wrong in a certain way and you had to struggle for that, does that mean that the community should continue to do things the wrong way? So the Gemara says, Misha achal shum v'reicho nodef. If someone ate garlic and his breath smells, yachzor v'yochal shum acher kadei she'reicho nodef, he should eat the garlic again? So I know it's hard. I respect that. I know of many people who have really struggled to do so. They've made sacrifices. But on some level, it doesn't matter, because your obligation starting today and every morning you get up is to do God's will. And if this is what the Torah's perspective is, that's what we're supposed to do. It doesn't really matter that until now we weren't doing it the right way. And the second pitch, I would say, is forget yourself. Think about what kind of community will be for your children, or your grandchildren, and for other people's children. Because if we don't address the issue, that's great. So many of us have finished paying yeshiva tuition, we move on from here. But what are we doing for our children who will stay in this community, or would like to stay in this community? And so I think that it's a hard lift, but I think that's really it's the correct way from a Torah perspective. I don't think there's a doubt about it. And I also don't think any other approach is going to work. I've addressed some of those in the podcast. Some people disagree about public funding. I don't want to talk about that tonight. I've made my comments there, and I stand by my comments. As I said, there are a lot of issues to work out, assuming that people will commit to paying. There is both this is not a popular thing to say, but on the one hand, the first step really has to be a lot of education. And once enough of the community recognizes its obligation, is willing to do it, I'm not averse to, in effect, the equivalent of public shaming. One of the nice things about tying one's tuition to real estate taxes is that I can find out, and you can find out, what every single person in this room pays in real estate taxes. We know what you're paying on your house. That's a public figure. We don't know how much money you make, but we know how much you're choosing to spend, and based upon the house that you have. And I think that, but you need the overwhelming majority of the community ready to buy into such a concept. But I think that that's the right way to do things. I think to me, it's the only way this community is really going to survive in a manner that's worth doing. Let me just conclude by stating that I've spoken about these two issues, one of materialism, one of how we fund our yeshivas. The issues, as I said, are connected. There are some underlying roots, but I actually want to decouple the issues because, as I said earlier, the materialism issue, which is a really serious issue, is to some extent dictated by individual choices. Yes, when people are doing things in a certain way, it's very hard for others who choose not to do it that way. I'm not minimizing that, but at least individuals do have a choice to spend less. Again, leaving out issue C of the general cost of living in the area, people have control of that, but people do not have control over the yeshiva tuition and that entire model. And so I think it's important to separate the two issues. They both merit attention, they both merit education, they both merit musar, but I think as a community, it's really important to turn our attention to the latter issue and to solve this problem.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Wieder. Somber. I just want to say quickly, talking about public shaming and things like that. I was a little bit concerned about inviting Rabbi Wieder here to the first place. So we maybe we get a chair for Rabbi Wieder. So just doing sit. You're going to sit? Okay. So just want to. I was a little concerned because. For those that don't know, I'm the Moshe Kindler, I'm the publisher of the Jewish Link, and it's okay. I think it's I hear. I'm allowed. I have a loud voice. And I get a call a few years ago from Rabbi Wieder, or an email, I think, and he said, I have a problem with the Jewish Link. And I asked what the problem was, and it turns out that the Jewish Link destroyed Rabbi Wider's snowblower. Apparently, he was trying to blow the snow, and apparently he didn't pick it up before Shabbos, or couldn't find it, and basically what happened is I owe Rabbi Wieder the cost of a snowblower, and he was not happy. So I was concerned about inviting him here, but he never sent me the bill. I owe him a snowblower. Please send me the bill anytime. The truth is, we're going to have questions for Rabbi Wieder after, but I also want to just introduce to have Doug Dubitsky and Shmuel Shiowitz. So there was a reason why we all watch the podcast. I don't know if we really feel this is an important issue. I just want to say, as a publisher of the Jewish Link, I feel blessed and privileged to be the publisher of a community that is thriving and growing. Okay, I recognize the challenges that Wieder says, but I want you to know I see a community that's really strong. We're opening Yeshiva. We're growing. We have challenges, but where I'm sitting, thank God, people see the Jewish Link is strong. It's healthy. I believe I want to be part of a community. Who wants to be a publisher of a community, a paper in a community that's dying? I don't, okay, and I'm not. But I really want to pose a question really to Doug and Shmuel here. I said, I really want to ask you both, and to tell you, and we'll get back to Wieder very shortly, is the professional roles that Doug and Shmuel have, is how does what you do on a daily basis, bear relevance to what Wieder just told us? And also, what are you seeing in your work with families and individuals that that bears relevance to what Rabbi Wieder says? I just start with that.
Sure. I think I have a loud enough voice also to just speak without the microphone. So thank you. I'm Doug Dubitsky. I'm a financial advisor. I actually like to consider myself a financial advocate. I've been in Teaneck for about 25 years. My children have gone through the yeshiva system, Yeshiva Noam, Maya Nod, and Frisch, my son, my daughter. And I've known Rabbi Wieder for about probably 12 or 13 years since I've been at Renat, but never really, other than speaking to him casually in shul, until I heard the podcast, said, there's a tremendous amount of what he's talking about that overlaps with my role as a professional advisor and how I approach clients. And what that is that the lack of financial balance in the community that the rabbi has spoken about so eloquently tonight and previously, I can't do anything about that. And I don't think any of us can do anything about that until we deal with the financial balance in our own individual lives. And so that's where I come in, right? I work with clients to bring financial balance to their lives on a protection-first basis. And so when Moshe says, how do I see this? How do I see the struggles that the rabbi's talking about in my profession and with what I do with people? Most people, be them young married couples, people in the middle age, people in retirement, approaching retirement, or at retirement, or deep into retirement. There's an art and science to financial planning that, unfortunately, most people are not following. And it's something that's been really misrepresented in the profession for many, many years. And the pitfalls that you see, I think, correlate to a community that's out of balance. And again, it would apply to the religious community and non-religious community anywhere. And that's there are four areas that seem to trip up people when they think about their financial lives: disorganization, lack of prioritization, focusing on a rate of return over savings rate, and guessing at their need, right? And when people do that, they're living a life that's out of balance financially. And if each individual is living a life that's out of balance financially, we have a community that's out of balance financially. It doesn't mean there aren't people who are successful. Doesn't mean there aren't people who have great success with something that gives them a tremendous rate of return. But there's an art and science to it, and this is where it comes in. That when you focus on a protection-first strategy, and that means that the first thing you do is protecting your future. When you're young and just starting out, that means protecting your income against illness, injury, premature death, right? Protecting yourself against the cost of things like long-term care and other issues as you get older. Protecting your retirement assets in retirement so you don't outlive your money, right? These are all strategies that bring people into balance. focusing on savings over rate of return, it doesn't matter what you do. If you're not saving, the rate of return is meaningless. And when people get caught up, just like they get caught up in the pictures on Instagram from people's vacations in Vail when they're skiing, they get caught up in stories that are really not necessarily accurate or great exaggerations. People talk about these tremendous investments they made and these tremendous returns they had, and they never tell you about the things they failed, and they never told you about the different pieces of it. And then, especially younger people, I'm seeing it with people my son's age and my daughter's age who believe this. They believe the stuff they're seeing online about how to deal with your money, about this lack of financial education. So, becoming a world-class saver, ensuring that people have liquidity for life events, so that when something comes up, because something always comes up. Life doesn't happen on a spreadsheet, and it doesn't ever happen in the order or in the way we think it's going to unfold. And when people don't provide some form of liquidity for these life events that come up, they end up going into debt. And when they go into debt, things start unraveling. And when things unravel for one person in the community, and then another, we have a community that's unraveling out of balance. And then the last piece comes very much to that, which is how do you ultimately live a debt-free life? And it's not easy, and I don't have all the answers there. But again, I know that when you have organization, when you're focusing on savings over rate of return, when you're not guessing at the need, but we're using real proven math and science to determine what people's needs are in terms of protection, in terms of the different aspects of their financial life. And when we're doing it in an order, a prioritized order that makes sense, you're much more likely to have, again, it's not about how much money you have. It's about having balance in your financial life that then also creates, I think, harmony in your family, harmony in your household, and allows you to be a really productive member of a community. And hopefully, if there's enough people like that, we can achieve what Rabbi Wieder has been talking about.
Thank you, Doug. First of all, thank you, Rabbi Wieder, and I want to thank Doug and Moshe for helping me co-host and bring Rabbi Wieder in and communicating this very important message. I've been in the real estate and mortgage business for over 20 years, and I'll tell you, mechanically, everything is the same as it has been from when I started. People want to buy a house, they come, they ask questions, and I help them facilitate and get a mortgage. But I'll tell you, logistically, my role has changed over the years significantly. It used to be somebody just needs a mortgage, and we would consult them, we advise them, and sign papers, get the mortgage, and move on. And over the years, what I've noticed is that there's a huge disconnect between what people are trying to acquire, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, and their basic physical understanding of what they're getting into and why they're doing things. And a lot of it is very, very much ties into what Rabbi Wieder was talking about, which is there's a premise and a notion that people are doing things not necessarily because they need to or want to. I tell people all the time, just because you can afford a mortgage, it doesn't mean you qualify for a mortgage. Just because you qualify for a mortgage doesn't mean you could afford it. And my role has changed so much. First of all, I do a lot of coaching, helping people with financial budgeting, and we peel back and I say, look, what are you looking? What are your objectives? What are your financial objectives? What are you looking to do? What is your long-term and short-term goals and financial plan? Because for a lot of people, they look at their friend, they look at their neighbor, they look at somebody in the apartments and they say, well, how is it that they can do this? I think I make more money than them. I know I make more money than them, and they just can't understand it. And I, for one, I have a very good, Rabbi Wieder was saying that we can see public records of what people are paying in taxes. I see firsthand what people are making, what their incomes are, what their assets are, what their expenses are, and there's a huge disconnect, and I'm not sure why that is. And a lot of it is because people are just living outside their means because they can't even catch their breath and understand what they're getting into. And it ties into, and it just boils down to a lack of physical understanding, education, and for an Orthodox from Jewish person, there's that disconnect between what is the role that money plays in my life and what does God want of me and what do I do with this money? And as I started with, I'll end with, my job is mechanically to help somebody get a mortgage, but I do much more than that because helping somebody understand that they're integrating a financial, a lot of people think, oh, I'm buying a house. This is the largest asset that I'll ever acquire in my lifetime, which is possibly very true. It's also the largest liability. And one of the things that I do is I try to help people understand how they should optimize their finances. Whether you buy the house, whether you don't buy the house, whether you sell the house, whether you don't sell the house, it's understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and speak to people, professionals and rabbinic leaders who can help you navigate through some of the decisions, and you shouldn't do it by yourself. And a lot of it just boils down to education, and we all commend all of you who've come out, people who listen to the podcast, people who read the paper and tune into information to try to equip themselves with more knowledge on how to better function in a very pressure-filled society. And kudos to all of you. Thank you.
By the way, you can always, Shmuel writes weekly, so if you have never heard him before, or read him before, which I'm sure most of you have not, or have read, you'd know that he kind of offers this advice almost every week. I have a question. I had a bunch of questions for Wieder. I'm going to throw most of them out, actually, because I really have one question. As I consider myself a little bit of an entrepreneur. Started the Jewish Link. What I heard from you was you're falling guilty, or it seems to me, is you're falling victim to what I call the professor, the academic trap, which is you see yourself in many ways as a Rosh Yeshiva, as a professor, but what you really are is on the cusp of being a nonprofit entrepreneur, a social entrepreneur. So I don't know what the audience's questions are going to be. What I hear is, Rabbi Wieder, are you ready to, in a sense, for Rabbi Wieder, when he came here and said this is a l'shem shamayim issue for us. He said this was his mission. This was important to him. He wasn't coming here just to, not for a fee or anything like that. This was a l'shem shamayim, a community mission for him. So I'm going to challenge you and say, what's next? I think we're happy to host you. We're happy to listen. I'm going to challenge you to, what does Rabbi Wieder do? What should you do next?
I might respond. Once I gave a very popular sikha about a particular social issue years ago, and students came up to me in the basement afterwards. Okay, well, what should we do? I said, I'm not an activist. I'm just the person whose job is to stir up your conscience. But the answer to what I'm doing is I'm starting to meet with rabbis in the community to start to put. I think there are two tracks. I think everybody in this room has to go and talk to the people around you, if you're not persuaded by me, then obviously you're not going to do it. But if you believe what I'm saying is correct, then you have to start selling it to your friends. You have to start preparing them that when the day comes that somebody says, okay, I want you to say, if this works in the community, will you give? We're not writing the check now. You have to get to that point. So one way you get to that point is that everybody here has to be ambassadors. The second thing is for rabbis to start talking about it from the pulpit, talking about it regularly, talking about the whole gamut of issues. That's where I'm working currently right now. As I said, I think those are really the two issues. There's the function of education, and there's sort of communal pressure of one kind or another. So the answer to your question, actually, I wouldn't consider myself much of an entrepreneur in any way, but that is what I'm doing currently.
I'll take it. I think you need a vehicle, but you need more than that. So, but okay,
I'm open to suggestions, but that's what I'm doing right now. Because if they don't talk about it, then I'm the only voice who's talking about it.
I think